and relieve ourselves?
Yeah.
So you go on one side and it'll go to the Gulf of Mexico, and I'll go on the other side and it'll go to the Pacific.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, guys, in Grimerica tonight, we've got a special episode. We've got Ed Nightingale in studio. We've got Randall Carlson, and a few people tagging along with them. We got some listeners, Bill, Daven. They're going to pop on for a bit. But first, as always, Cracklin' Graham.
Cracklin' Graham. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. It's nice to have you guys in studio because, of course, we're always doing this on Skype. So for once, we get to see each other face to face. Kind of get to know what like Joe Rogan feels like because he always gets guys in studio. So feels good. Yeah. Feels good. And yeah, we've had you guys both on the show before, and you guys have presented at Paradigm, and you're going to be there again this year. So we get to talk about that a little bit. And but first, we can get into why you guys are actually in Calgary. It's not because of us, and it's not because of other good stuff that we have. It's because you're on a little journey, on a little research trip, I think, right? And there's been actually some news recently you put on your website, I think, that has to do with what you guys are looking at, with the impacts from thousands of years ago, right? So,
oh yeah. Well,
so welcome to the show.
Thanks. Now, you guys are part of the reason.
Yeah, I was going to say.
A small part of the reason, but part of the... hey, we're going to
could have flown into Vancouver or something and gone up,
Grimerica boys.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to have you.
Well, hey, look, you're putting us up.
Yeah, thanks a lot,
I got a great nap in this afternoon. Why would I have done that?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
It's the least we could do.
Yeah. So you guys are journeying...
We're going to make a loop across the Continental Divide, up into the plateau country, head probably up to Prince George, come back down through the Rocky Mountain Trench, zigzagging around, exploring a bunch of different sites.
Nice.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
And it's part of this larger framework of study that we've been doing up here in the Pacific Northwest for about the last 20 years now. Because you guys live in the backyard of one of the great epic catastrophic events in the history of the Earth, right here. Where you guys live, was part of the ice-free corridor at one point, which was the zone between the two great ice sheets of the last ice age. The Cordilleran, which was over the Rocky Mountains, reached essentially from right here over to the Pacific Ocean and mantled all of the Canadian Rockies and the coastal mountains, pretty much thousands of feet thick. And then east of here, you had the Laurentide, the great ice sheet that reached from the northern United States up to the Arctic Circle, and from about right here to the Atlantic Ocean. It was right in this zone where the two ice sheets met.
Like zone, like as in Calgary?
As in Calgary,
Wow.
Yes. Calgary sits right in the middle of what would have been called the ice-free corridor, which was for years been considered the pathway by which mankind first arrived into North America and South America, as well as a lot of the great megafauna. I certainly think that it was a corridor for temporary periods of time that did serve as a migratory pathway. I don't necessarily think that that is the first or the only way that humans came into the Western Hemisphere, because there's evidence now that people were in South America 14,000 years ago and perhaps much longer. And the old version of people slowly migrating down from Alaska through the ice-free corridor into the lower United States, down through Central America and into South America. The time frame for that is inconsistent with people already being down there 13 or 14,000 years ago, and perhaps much longer than that.
Right.
However, it certainly at one point did serve as a significant region of geography, being between these two great ice sheets. And probably for short periods of time, or maybe roughly say 14 or 15,000 years ago to about 18 to 20,000 years ago, the two ice sheets may have coalesced into and blocked the corridor. And then around 15,000 years ago, the climate started warming a bit. From the depths of the full glacial cold, the ice sheets began to shrink back a bit, and then that was when the corridor could have possibly opened up and served as a pathway, a migratory pathway. Then, at about 13,000 years ago, was when the hammer came down. The more orderly process of global amelioration from the ice age was suddenly interrupted, and you apparently had enormous meltwater events that poured down off the ice sheets and would have followed this pathway right here through this region. And you guys have gone and visited the big rock, right?
Yep.
Okotoks.
Okotoks Erratic.
Yeah, the Okotoks Erratic. So there you have an example of an 18,000-ton metaquartzite erratic, quarried probably from the region of Mount Robson up in Jasper Park area.
Yeah.
And that's where you guys are headed?
Yeah, we're headed. That's on our loop. And then that would have been transported via the Athabasca River Valley out and being carried aboard an iceberg that was then being carried in meltwater. That meltwater carried the iceberg down through the meltwater, through the ice-free corridor, along with probably thousands of other icebergs, many of which had similar rock loaded onto them. And when those icebergs came to ground, they melted away and left their cargo sitting out on the edge of the prairie. And that's Okotoks is the biggest of those erratics, but there's hundreds of them.
So it was like when the Bow River was just fucking crazy.
Yeah.
And that would
So
be,
is that what created the Bow River, like the Bow River ravine kind of thing?
I always picture
Yes.
it like fell off the side and like sunk.
Because it's just pretty much like carved out by that.
Well, see, and that's one of your key indicators that if you're looking at a channel and the sides are sheer and vertical, that almost certainly means that it's a catastrophic erosional event that created that channel. Not so much a slow, because the slow erosion is slowly smoothing out that profile. You see, it's instead of sheer canyon walls with sharp edges, the slow erosion is rounding off those corners and slowly turning the sheer walled channels into V-shaped channels. And you can actually see all over the western United States, and in the region where we're going, there's going to be many of these sheer walled channels. Like famous one that we've been through several times is Canyon de Chelly, down that straddles the Arizona-New Mexico border. Actually, it's in Arizona, but it's part of that group of mountains there. Very sheer walled. The gorge of the Little Colorado River. I mean, the list goes on. We've probably looked at several dozen of these sheer walled channels or canyons, and that's almost certainly going to be the result of catastrophic water flows.
That's like Drumheller.
Yeah, it's part of that, I'm sure, right?
No,
Yeah.
What's Drumheller? That's a region around here, right?
It's just east of here, and it's where the dinosaur park is, the National Dinosaur Park, and
Yeah, it's just like a little trench cut out of the prairies.
Now, are those Cretaceous dinosaurs? Do you know? Probably
the big ones.
Probably
T-Rex.
the late Mesozoic big ones.
Yeah.
Oh, the big. Okay.
I think so. Darren, the big
T-Rex.
ones, right?
They found a T-Rex there.
Yeah, so it's probably late Cretaceous dinosaurs. In any case, they're minimum of 65, 66 million year old rocks, right?
Yeah.
Probably older. I'm not sure the age of that particular dinosaur deposit. But here's the interesting thing. Those Cretaceous rocks that preserved those dinosaur bones were almost certainly buried under hundreds of feet of rock. And then when you had the Great Glacial Meltdown, it stripped away the overlying layers and exposed the underlying layers that contained the dinosaur bones. Now, I'm thinking that perhaps those dinosaur bones might be late, maybe even terminal Cretaceous, which would be very interesting because then visiting that site, you're basically seeing a juxtaposition of two great catastrophes in Earth history.
Right.
The catastrophe that took the dinosaurs off the global stage and the catastrophe that brought the Ice Age to an end 13,000 years ago.
Now, you guys posted something recently on your website from physics.org, I think, and it was about that cataclysmic event of a certain age, evidence for it.
Yeah.
13,000 years ago. So this is becoming
Mainstream.
Oh, it's slowly becoming mainstream. Yeah, and it's encountering a lot of objection and a lot of resistance.
Oh, it still is, even though there's.
I haven't heard as much lately because I think that every objection that's been raised by the critics has been resoundingly answered by those who've been proposing this theory. Alan West and James Kennett and Richard Firestone and their colleagues that have been working on this now since the mid 2005, 2006. I think they first published in 2007.
And to summarize that, it's an actual evidence of a field of debris of
to summarize it appears that the late Wisconsin Ice Age, which was the last phase of the Great Wisconsin Ice Age, was abruptly terminated between 11 and 13,000 years ago, and it appears that the trigger could very well have been something from space, something from outer space encountering the Earth, an alien, if you will. But in this case, the alien was, I'm inclined to believe it was the debris of a disintegrating comet rather than an asteroid, but that's still to be determined. It was a bolide, which we could use that term as the all-encompassing term for something from outer space.
Okay, we were just talking about that, the terms. We were like, what is an asteroid, a boloid, or a meteor?
Meteorite.
An asteroid is different than a hemorrhoid. It's not, although people do get the two confused and wonder why is a hemorrhoid not actually called an asteroid.
Yeah.
But I don't know the answer to that at all. But in any case,
it's a meteorite.
So
does that have to be small?
Or a meteor wrong?
No, it doesn't have to be small. What was the Tunguska one? What was that called? The Tunguska one was called the Tunguska event. No, but what was was it a meteorite? Or?
Well, it depends on who you ask. And they're still arguing, was it a comet or was it an asteroid?
Oh, okay. So they don't even know.
But here's the thing. If you look at these things, there's no clear dividing line between comets and asteroids. In fact, I think some estimates are that 25 or 30% of the asteroids out there might be the devolatilized nuclei of comets. So, it's hard to say. There's a continuum between.
What's the difference? Is it just a size thing?
No, it's not size. It's composition.
Oh,
an asteroid is going to be primarily, think of it in simple terms as a rock, and a comet in simple terms as a snowball, although that's not an exact metaphor. It kind of gives you the idea.
Yeah, right.
And an asteroid
asteroids are worse.
It depends. See, asteroids, the thing about comets is that they move fast. Comets have velocity on their side. And a head-on collision with a comet would be really, really traumatic. Or so would it. And again, it depends on size, because comets, a small comet might be a mile or two in diameter, but a big comet might be 50 miles or more, which would be about 80 kilometers. And if a comet of that size, if we encountered one of that size, we'd be
a bad day in an Uber.
We'd be bending over and kissing our asses goodbye for sure.
Speaking of that, I have to say one thing for Stuart, who left. He was here. He says he just wants to say he wants to die in the first wave. He wants to be at the ground zero.
He wants to be at ground zero?
Yeah. I told him I want to survive.
Of what?
Of the catastrophe. Yeah.
When's that?
I don't know.
Well,
any day.
Don't look at me. You're looking at me like you expect me to know.
We should pick a day.
Listen, I've seen so many failed predictions.
We got to put it way out there, like 2065, like when we're old enough that we won't give a shit that we were wrong.
Well, I don't know. I'm older than you guys, and I would still give a shit if it.
True.
I think that there's looking at the tempo that's now emerging, which, is not going to be accepted by all mainstream scientists, but there's a lot of evidence that events have happened a whole lot more frequently than previously estimated. And you got to bear in mind that a lot of the earlier estimates were based on crater counts. Like when an asteroid, a rocky asteroid or an iron asteroid strikes the surface of the Earth, it leaves an impact scar that can hang around for millions of years and be looked at later. But for an object to strike the surface of the Earth, there's two factors, density and size. If you go down, you mentioned a Tunguska object, let's say it was about 150 feet in diameter, roughly 150 feet in diameter. That's 100 to 150. It was moving fast, so it had a big kinetic punch to it, right? But it wasn't very big in the cosmic sense. But it was enough to completely obliterate any major metropolitan area on Earth, completely. I mean, it utterly devastated over 830 square miles of old-growth taiga forest up in Siberia. We're talking 3-foot thick trees that are just snapped off like they were just fragile matchsticks. And you think 830 square miles is a lot, close to a couple of thousand square kilometers. So if you go if you go and look at any major city, like Atlanta's, I use that as down in the area where we live as a good example, because if you look at the perimeter freeway, 285, that runs around Atlanta, the area within that is very close to 800 square miles. I've calculated that out. So basically, that's a big sprawling metropolitan area, and it's about the equivalent in force to a 15 megaton hydrogen bomb, which would be pretty traumatic. But see, here's the thing about the Tunguska object. It blew up in the air.
Right.
It blew up in the
leave
air.
a crater.
It did not leave a crater.
Yeah.
Once those trees rotted, there's not much evidence.
1,000 years from now, there's going to be very little evidence there that anything like this had happened, right? Now, by contrast, probably one of the most famous craters, at least in our neck of the woods, is Meteor crater in Arizona. And it's 3/5 of them, it's a kilometer wide and 600 feet deep. It was formed by an iron asteroid, and we know it was iron because we found pieces of it, splayed out around the crater itself in the debris apron. Well, it was an iron asteroid, right? Now, that iron asteroid was no bigger than the Tunguska object, but because of its increased density, it was able to fully and successfully penetrate the atmosphere and strike the ground, leaving a big, obvious hole in the ground that we can look at now and go, yeah, something really major happened there. And, 1,000 years from now, that hole will still be there. Whereas the evidence of Tunguska event will be gone. Now, if you look at the census based upon meteor counts of things that have fallen to Earth that have been picked up, and by looking at emission spectra of the objects going by us in space, it's pretty well determined that the population of the lower density objects, which would be in the realm of comets to carbonaceous chondritic meteorites, which would include whatever the Tunguska object was, those objects are about 10 times more prevalent than the iron objects that leave the obvious holes in the ground for us to count. See, and that's something that's a fact that's been well established, but I just don't find that many people following the implications of that, which is that there could have been a whole lot more Tunguska type events that we wouldn't know about.
But how big can one of those events get, like the size of that asteroid, before it's actually not going to explode in the air and it's going to hit the Earth? Like,
well, again,
again,
it depends on the composition. The let's just say, for the sake of a rough concept, that the iron asteroid that struck Arizona and left the meteor crater was about the same size as the Tunguska object, 100 to 150 feet in diameter.
Yeah.
Now, for a lower density object like say in the middle of the range, which would be the carbonaceous chondritic meteorites, I'm thinking 300 to 400 feet. At that point, once it gets that big, it's going to successfully penetrate the atmosphere. But it's also a function of the angle that it comes in. If it comes in at a low angle, it's got to pass through a lot more dense atmosphere before it hits the ground than if it's coming in at 90 degrees to the surface. So that's also a factor that has to be worked in. And the Tunguska object apparently did come in at a low angle. And I think that the object that encountered the Earth 13,000 years ago, the encounter took place at a fairly small angle, so that the object would have come in from this area, maybe at 25 to 30 degrees from the horizon, and was probably a multiple fragmentation impact, similar to what we saw in 1994 with the Shoemaker-Levy 9 impact into Jupiter. When 21 pieces plummeted into Jupiter in less than a week. Yeah.
Was that by Calgary? There's impacts by here?
I don't think Calgary was in the direct line of an impact. I think Calgary was in the line of the secondary effects of the impacts, because what the impacts would have done was several things simultaneously, which when we get back to like the Okotoks Big Rock, one of the difficulties, the Okotoks is the biggest erratic in that whole train of erratics that reaches from where the Athabasca River comes out of the mountains all the way down into Montana. It's about a 500-mile train, right? The difficulty with explaining that is that, the origin of those rocks is on the western side of the Continental Divide. And you guys are on the eastern side of the Continental Divide. You have to come up with a way of somehow transporting those rocks, and I could pull up a slide here on the... and show you, just so we can be looking at it, and I can kind of tell you about what I'm talking about here, because the Okotoks doesn't look like a typical glacial erratic, in that glacial erratics are usually ground and scratched and striated by the
iceberg,
by the glaciers themselves. And if we look at Okotoks, this is one view of it. Yeah, you'll notice it's got sharp edges and square corners. You see that? Mm-hmm. The corners aren't ground off like they would be if they were transported, it was the result of typical glacier transportation. If I look at this next slide, here you can see that it's actually, the original rock was in 3 pieces, and it's broken. But you see, this rock has been transported over 50 miles from its place of origin. But if you look at here in this slide, you can see very clearly the square corners, the sharp edges, the 2 fractures that have broken the original single rock into 3 parts. And you can also see that the part on the right there and the middle part have sunk into what was at the time the erratic was deposited was soft, still undoubtedly wet alluvium, which allowed the rocks to sink in. See, but typical glacier transport, when you're looking at, maybe a few feet or a meter or 2 per year, you're talking about a long period of time to get that rock from its source up by Mount Robson and dump it out half an hour south of Calgary. See, and without the separate pieces, being separated further to where they would not end up emplaced together like you see them here. Well, the only way you can really successfully explain how you could transport this rock as you see it here is through iceberg rafting.
Right.
Now we have to carry that idea to its next implication, which is that what is the size of the iceberg necessary to carry an 18,000 ton raft cargo like this? And the answer is that it's probably going to be the size of a tanker ship. Okay, let's go to the next step. Well, then what kind of water flow is going to be necessary to float an iceberg the size of a tanker ship? And you're talking about a pretty significant flood of water.
What about impact? Was it dislodged due to an impact?
Well, I think that clearly the erratics train, and this idea is not original with me, it was actually first proposed by a geologist, a Canadian geologist from this area, C. Warren Hunt, back in the mid-'70s. He published several articles in the Canadian Journal of Petroleum Geology, which I'm sure all of you guys read that regularly.
Yes, I do, yes.
Okay, so you've probably seen that article then. But in there, 2 articles where he proposed that I think he called it the Athabasca flood, where he was pointing out that what other geologists seem to be overlooking was what I just described, that these erratics were transported aboard icebergs. And then you have the problem of simultaneously quarrying the rock, creating the icebergs, and creating the floodwater to float the icebergs. And his idea back then was seismic shaking that was the consequence of a very close passage of a cosmic object. But as I recall, he did not actually and explicitly invoke an actual impact. But I think I did have an extensive phone conversation with him back in, I think it was 98 or 99, before the first time I came out here. And I think he's passed away in this interim because he was quite elderly when I talked to him. And I think at that point he had actually now was thinking an actual impact. Because an impact could accomplish all of those things. I mean, it delivers an enormous kinetic punch that could cause the fracturing and the avalanching of these mountain shoulders onto the ice, fracture the ice, melt the ice, transport it, and ultimately deposit it out on the Alberta prairie.
So are you able to actually find the locations of some of this in Mount Robson when you go there, do you think?
I don't know, because I haven't been there yet. And that's one of the things we're going to look at. I would be surprised without much more detailed, in-depth study of just a cursory reconnaissance mission would be able to determine precisely where the rock came from. But I would think that enough studies of the rock and the exposure ages of the rock, I mean, you'd probably have to get into doing, cosmogenic dating of the rock surfaces, because if you have a landslide and a rock falls off a cliff face, it's now going to be subject to cosmic ray bombardment. And that cosmic ray bombardment leaves an imprint that can actually be dated. And it would require, I think, some pretty skilled technical efforts to
match all that up.
to match it up. Yeah.
Expensive
And I'm not
too, probably.
And what?
Expensive too, probably.
Expensive too. Yeah. But if you guys, can raise,
somebody.
maybe not that expensive. I don't know. I've never priced cosmogenic ray dating.
No, not any recent prices.
George, do you have any idea? Okay. Well, we got a man here we can put on it.
He's a man. He's a man too.
We need a deal.
So anyways, that's one of the things we're going to be investigating. But then the fact that, we've been looking at these floods south of here, where the geologists now admit that, there were these huge catastrophic floods. The Missoula floods is usually the name given to them. And the byproduct of those floods is the channel scabland of eastern Washington. And, we have crisscrossed that area. I've lost count how many times, back and forth, looking at all the vagaries and the different aspects of that. And I think I've seen enough now myself to know that the ultimate source of the floodwaters is not Lake Missoula in western Montana, but that instead Lake Missoula in western Montana was a temporary holding pond for waters emanating from the Canadian Cordillera coming down the route of the Rocky Mountain Trench. And I can actually pull that up here, and I'll show you an interesting topo map of the Rocky Mountain Trench.
We're in the Rocky Mountain Trench.
No, we're not.
No, you are not in the Rocky Mountain Trench here.
Well, you might be right now. I don't know.
Spiritual.
Are we going to the Rocky Mountain?
You might be in the Rocky Mountain Trench.
Are we going to the Rocky Mountain Trench tomorrow?
We will actually cross the Rocky Mountain Trench on the way to Revelstoke.
Will we stop?
Well, if you would like, Darren, we can certainly stop. It's a interesting. It might be a great place to stop and relieve ourselves.
Yeah.
Graham doesn't do that. He uses a jug.
Who does?
He makes fun of me because occasionally I just pee in a jug when I'm driving. So.
Well, hey, you got to do what you got to do. And
you just love it, eh?
But we will be crossing the Rocky Mountain Trench tomorrow, and this file somehow got closed down here. Brad, I think we need your technical expertise here to get the Cordilleran back up. Okay, we got that. Now go back. There we go. I'm going to show you guys the a topographic map of the Rocky Mountain Trench. It's a very interesting geological feature. Have you ever looked at it you know what I'm talking about?
Spent some time.
There's a few trenches. There's a few trenches along there, right?
Yeah. Did we lose that damn thing again? Well, let's pull it out and put it back in.
That's what she said.
I need a button. My soundboard's not working.
Why not? What happened?
Died.
Really? What do you mean, the battery? Don't tell me it's a battery.
Yeah.
Oh, that's lame.
Down.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's weak.
We'll scroll down. And there,
Twice in one day.
Let's go to this one right here.
Really? What, the weakness or the battery? What else was it?
You didn't see the email today?
What email?
All right,
I'll
gentlemen.
show you later.
If you will cast your attention up here, you
sorry.
can see this thing coming right down here.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's
quite
a big one,
obvious.
right?
Yeah.
To say the least.
It's a giant downfold into crust.
Where's the Athabasca Glacier on that right now?
The Athabasca Glacier would be somewhere in here along the Athabasca River.
Oh, okay, yeah.
This is the Athabasca, and there's Mount Robson, which was the area which was the source of the Erratics train. It's strewn all down along here, which was where the ice-free corridor was through here. So we're going to loop around this way up to Prince George and then come down the Rocky Mountain Trench.
Nice.
And then we'll probably follow the path. What I think the evidence shows is that there was an enormous current that came down the Rocky Mountain Trench,
Right.
continued down this way, and also split off on the Athabasca River, quarrying the Erratics train from mountains in the area of Mount Robson here, carried it out here, and then right out here where the water discharged off the Cordilleran ice sheet here. Over here was the Laurentide ice sheet. So what happened was the water was deflected south, carrying its cargo of thousands of giant icebergs, that many of which were loaded with these metaquartzite boulders.
So your feeling is that it was actually excavated from the flow and not from an impact? Or
no, I don't, because the glaciers pre-existed. I mean, the glaciers filled the Rocky Mountain Trench.
Right.
What they did do, though, was when the glaciers melted away, they left an enormous thick layer of silty, gravelly, bouldery material, hundreds and in some places thousands of feet thick on the floor of the trench. In some of the areas, like some of the lakes in the Cordilleran region, what you call the fjord lakes, like Mount Shuswap. Did I say it right?
Shuswap.
Yeah.
Shuswap.
Yeah.
Bonaparte, Kamloops, Okanagan.
Yeah.
These lakes are extremely deep. They're 700, 800, 1,000 feet deep, the lakes themselves. And then you get to the bottom of the lake, but that's sediment. And the sediment can be 1,000 feet thick. Right. So if you were to take the water out and the sediment, you have a carved bedrock trough that in some cases is couple of miles wide and as deep as the Grand Canyon.
Enough to hide the Ogopogo.
Enough to hide the Ogopogo, yes. Oh, and by the way, that's one of the things. If we get some extra time, we're going to go ahead and try to.
Bill can camp on the shore and try and get the Ogopogo.
Well, I've heard that they actually make pretty good eating.
I've never caught one. I fished there. And I caught a fish, and I was a little nervous when I went to get it out of the water.
You could keep your eyes open for Sasquatch too. There's some Sasquatch country around there as well.
Well, what I would like to do is to stage a battle between Bigfoot and Ogopogo. I think that would be a big hit.
We have a picture of Bigfoot riding the Ogopogo, actually.
Picture of Darren riding in the Ogopogo?
Bigfoot riding the Ogopogo.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's a picture of me shooting a Bigfoot.
Yeah, that's true. And there's a picture of me saving Bigfoot. We have an ongoing thing here about whether to shoot him or not.
Okay, I understand now. I'm seeing how sacrilegious you guys are.
I say don't shoot him.
Oh, you say don't shoot him. Darren,
I'm the one like jumping in front of Sasquatch, taking the bullet.
Okay, and Darren is the one pulling the trigger?
Yeah.
Okay. I see that relation. I can see
that is
how dynamic this.
It's worth Graham's. I'll take that risk. I'm willing to risk Graham to take down a Bigfoot.
I don't know. I don't think I'd want that karma.
So while we're off topic a bit here, I do have a question for you from one of our listeners, if you don't mind me asking.
Are the listeners able to? They're not able to see any of this. That's too bad.
So this is actually from Brent.
There actually might be a way. If you send me those pictures when I release the podcast, I might be able to do it.
I'll just give you the file before I leave.
Yeah,
before we part company, I'll just give you guys the file.
Yeah, we could put them on YouTube and actually do that.
Okay,
and
good.
I could also do it in the podcast too. I think I can make it so that the episode art changes at certain timestamps.
Oh, that'd be pretty good. Wow. So even on your phone, you could see what you're talking about.
Okay.
So this is from.
A bunch of people might be looking at their phone in a couple weeks, totally disappointed.
Okay. So
you can always put up a picture of Ed or something.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is from Brent Curry, who was almost here tonight, but he couldn't make it. So I figured I want to ask you this question, Randall. So he says, so this is my question. Graham Hancock has a theory that psychedelics may have taught early men how to live or have imparted wisdom to us that allowed us to develop beyond just being a simple primate. In Grimerica's first talk with Randall, he mentioned the part in Genesis when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit and their eyes were opened. Opened meaning they gained knowledge. Could the forbidden fruit have been psychedelic drugs?
Well, I think just the question implies the answer, certainly. I mean, if we look at candidates, I can't think of a more suitable candidate than that. And, here's what's interesting. All of this stuff and this research that I've been doing since basically 1969.
Woodstock.
I didn't make it to Woodstock. I left for Woodstock. I left Minneapolis with a buddy of mine, and we got as far as middle of Wisconsin, and our car broke down. So we just hitchhiked back home, and I've regretted that ever since.
Sure.
One of the few regrets I have in life.
Not making it there?
Yeah,
Well,
I should have just kept hitchhiking, but nobody had any idea.
Yeah,
Nobody had any idea what it was going to turn into. And I had just seen the Grateful Dead like 2 or 3 times, by that time. And anyways, I used to go to rock concerts that were just south of Minneapolis at a place called Eden Prairie Airport, and it was on these bluffs of what was now the Minnesota River Valley, but what used to be called River Warren. Of course, I think they hadn't figured out back then that it was River Warren, but River Warren was a couple of thousand times bigger than the modern day Minnesota River that flows as this little trickle down in the bottom of this huge deep canyon. Right, this huge, or not canyon, a valley that's about 3 to 5 miles wide, and the banks are 200 to 300 feet high. So there was a break in the music, and I wandered over to the edge of the bluff, and I looked down into this valley, and I saw on the other side from where I was standing a matching set of bluffs. And then down in the valley below me, I saw the modern day Minnesota River, and noticed that it was in a channel, and there were bluffs on both sides of it, and it was like a miniature version of this big channel. And at that point, I kind of had this, if you want to call it a vision, if you will, that this whole big channel was once completely filled with water. And of course, at that point, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about geology. I didn't know anything about the fact that there might have been this massive meltdown. I had never even envisioned such a thing, thought about it, but standing there on that bluff, I just had this very distinct impression. And what's interesting about that is that, of course, I was in an altered state of consciousness when I was looking at that and having this vision of this whole channel being filled with water. And really at that point, it was so striking to me, that idea, that immediately I didn't follow it. But a number of years later, I came back. The next summer, actually, was my first trip out here into this area, not here, but south of here into Montana, Idaho, and Washington. And I traveled down the Columbia Gorge, which, have you ever traveled down the Columbia Gorge, up or down?
I did. I drew.
And you know how incredibly spectacular it is. Well, a lot of what you're looking there in the gorge, as you come down, you're going to see these huge terrace complexes on both sides, and you're going to see major delta fans splayed out from the mouths of tributary rivers. Well, again, in 70, I had never studied geology. I didn't know anything about that. But by going down, I just came away from that, a couple of traverses up and down the Columbia Gorge, that there was this story there, that somehow the landscape had preserved some kind of story, and I had no clue what it meant. All I knew was that these forms were so spectacular and striking and dramatic that at some point, maybe 3, 4, 5 years later, these impressions that I got from these experiences gestated in the back of my mind, to where, at some point I read a number of things, on more fringe science stuff, Velikovsky and Atlantis stuff and all of that. But always there was these things that I'd seen, in these experiences. And so then, I think it was in the late 70s, I was talking about this. First time I ever started giving any public talks or classes on this. And I brought this up, and there was a fellow in one of the classes who he wasn't a professional geologist, but he was a degree in geology. And I was talking about in the Mississippi River, also up there just south of Minneapolis, there are huge bluffs and terraces on the rivers and so forth. And I was describing how, the Minnesota River appeared to have been carrying enormous amounts of water in the Mississippi and the Columbia. And then he said, well, no. He interrupted me and said, you're looking at stuff that was created over millions of years, And I said, no, I don't think so. I think it was something catastrophic. And we had a disagreement, and it was an amicable disagreement, but we disagreed about that. And what that did was it really inspired me to really begin to study geology formally. So I, got so into it that every outing and traveling that I did from that point on, I was looking at the Earth. I was looking at the rocks and the landscape and the rivers and the lakes and wondering about origins and what was the story encoded in the landscape. And, the upshot of it, of course, was that in our disagreement, I was right. And he was basically just invoking the paradigm of one grain of sand and one drop of water at a time explains everything.
See, there's a reason why you didn't make it to Woodstock. This is what I think. I don't think this path would have happened
if I had gone to Woodstock.
Another kind of rock guy, rock and roll or something.
It could have happened. I could have.
You could have started a music career.
Well, I did have a short music career for 3 years, and then it derailed completely.
There you go. But now look,
insanity prevailed. Music career derailed. Although I was the one sane one in the band.
You must have been a bass player then, right?
No, I was the percussionist.
Always a bass player. Stable.
No, in this case, it was the oud player. Oops.
the oud player.
So we'll get to you too, Ed, at some point here. But we also have Daven Thon here. He's one of our listeners, and he drove all the way up from Lethbridge. So I want to give you the opportunity to chime in.
Definitely. I was hearing what he was saying earlier, and it was really interesting. But did we answer the question?
Yeah.
We did.
Yeah. Adam and Eve.
Okay, I totally think that. And I totally think that we can use psychedelics to come to a much more intimate understanding and awareness of our own past on this planet. Yeah. Let me throw that in. I think it could be a tremendous tool because geologists go out there and you look at all these different clues. You look at stratigraphy and you look at lithology and you look at you look at palynology, the pollens that are preserved, and you take all of these pieces and try to put them together to get a picture of what actually happened, right? Well, maybe we could actually just kind of bypass a lot of that. Not that I'm saying we should do without it, but I'm convinced that we could use the agents of the Earth to come to a much more intimate understanding of the processes that shape the Earth itself.
Yeah.
Because, in fact, I think the Earth wants us to know this story.
Yeah.
I think that's why we humans, with our 1,200 cubic centimeter brains, or are we closer to 1,600? I think we're closer to 1,600.
I'm not too sure, but I entirely agree with you on that. It's almost as if we're, I've heard it explained like we're a defense mechanism for the planet, because as much as we suffer detrimentally from some of these cosmic impacts, but certainly the Earth might not like it too much, I would assume,
That's right, Dave, and I would say that. And I would say that what happens is that in the early stages of the Earth, in its formation and the introduction of biological life to Earth, these cosmic processes were absolutely mandatory. They had to happen. The comets probably do. The hydrosphere of this planet is almost certainly the result of thousands and thousands and thousands of comet impacts in the early history of the Earth. The introduction of biological material, of precursors to organic life, probably introduced by comets. I think the arguments in favor of an exobiological origin are gaining momentum every year, right? Okay, but at some point, the process has to stop. Or what it does is it keeps resetting the global ecological clock back to zero. And then what we saw happen 12 or 13,000 years ago was we saw a decapitation of the food chain as a consequence of these events. Half the great megafauna species that existed on the Earth at that time did not survive through these events.
Well, one thing that I've always found interesting is the fact that it seems like for every one of these impacts, the one that wiped out the dinosaurs, the one that wiped out half of the mega mammals, at the end of the day, as much as we suffer, we come out smelling a little better at the end of things. We don't have to worry. I mean, we wouldn't have evolved to this point had the dinosaurs been around, and things would be a lot different. I mean, when we go camping, you have to worry about cougars and bears. Well, what if we had to worry about woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers? Like just 13,000 years ago, those events have made the conditions in North America more favorable for intelligent life to spread and proliferate, again, potentially to become a better defense mechanism now that we've hit a nice equilibrium for the planet. And we don't need more water. We don't need more introduction of any more elements from outer space unless potentially we bring them in ourselves.
Yes. When you get up in the morning, one of your major concerns of the day is that you're you're not too worried about getting consumed by Arctodus simus, the great cave bear, or the great short-faced bear, or dire wolves, or the Pleistocene lion, or the list goes on and on and on. There was just enormous predators that lived on the planet at the end of the last ice age. One of the things that did happen as a result of that, and there's interesting evidence now showing that there was probably a major depopulation event that associated with that. But in the aftermath of all of these catastrophes, once things settled out, bear in mind, when this ice is melting, sea level is raising, right? And sea level is raising, it's drowning hundreds of thousands of square miles of coastal line around the continents of the planet, right? But at the same time, thousands, hundreds of thousands of square miles, even millions of square miles are being released from this icy prison that they've been in for thousands of years. So you've got this major real estate reorganization that's going on the planet. Humans probably, in many cases, cultural groups did become extinct, such as the Clovis, which suddenly disappeared in the aftermath of these 13,000 year ago events. And then there's about 1,000-year hiatus and then we see the Folsom culture show up. But it's likely that all over the planet, what you basically had was a major dispersal event in the wake of this. But ironically, after the cessation of the Ice Age and the rising of the sea levels, once sea levels got back to where they are close to now, the planet entered this period of time that the paleoclimatologists have referred to as the climatic optimum, or the hypsothermal. And it was this period of maybe 3,000, possibly 4,000 years where humans were worshiping the earth in the form of this pregnant earth goddess, documented extensively by Maria Gimbutas, who showed that during this period of time there was no evidence of strife, conflict, or warfare.
And when was this?
This was between like 6,000 and 9,000 or 10,000 years ago. It doesn't have any precisely defined dates because this period would have different places around the planet transformed at different rates and so on. So, the last. Probably one of the last remnants of this goddess worshiping culture might have been, like an example would be Crete, which maybe went down, maybe 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, somewhere in that area. But yeah, what you saw is that between the period of about 5,000 and 6,000 years, you see this transition from the worshiping of the earth in the form of this pregnant, corpulent, fertile earth goddess into worshiping wrathful sky deities.
Well, and what they call them, the Venus figurines, don't they? With
those
large,
yes.
And that they always find that they may have been more complex at one time, but they're just basically torsos now. And after I'd heard you talk about that before, and some other people discuss it, I mean, it seems entirely rational. After a cataclysm, when we were given the charge to replenish the earth, that there was no need. I mean, it was Thomas Hobbes, I believe, that said all conflict stems out of fear and diffidence, a fear and uncertainty of the power of your foe. Well, if you're not fighting over resources, you have no reason to be afraid. You have no reason to worry about if the other is stronger than you. If there's an abundance, you do not have any need to take or be taken from.
Exactly.
So there is that. But then as resources, whether humanity grew or conditions changed and organization became necessary, then you see the agriculture energy take over.
Well, that's this period, which Gimbutas called the civilization of the goddess, basically, was a period where the arts flourished. There was music. Epic poetry had a lot of roots in this period of time. And you have to look, it's like in the wake of any catastrophe, you have what a ecologist or a biologist would refer to as a refugium, a place where, for whatever reason, because of the luck of the draw or whatever, life manages to survive intact. And it's from these refugia that basically life reaches out and recolonizes the devastated areas. And Brad and I visited last October. I paid my first visit to Mount St. Helens to be able to study the recovery in the aftermath, where you had about 300 square miles utterly obliterated and turned into a lunar landscape, and now 35 years later it's
probably
well on its way to
right?
recovery.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Nature actually, in the long-term scheme of things, nature has remarkable recuperative abilities, but it's basically taken, I think, human beings 10,000 years to essentially reestablish ourselves on this planet as a global force. And for roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years, this would have been the era of be fruitful and multiply. Because if the human population has been diminished dramatically, and in fact, what you would most likely have is small groups of survivors who basically had no knowledge of what's going on in the rest of the world, who don't know necessarily that we might be the only ones, because as far as they know and can perceive, their whole world has been eradicated, right? So what you were saying, Daven, about it makes sense. And then when there's no conflict for resources and you're a small group, tribal group, and you maybe encounter other people, maybe it's more of a cause for celebration than it is for fear.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
You
and
see?
also too, I wonder if there isn't some amount of I don't know, a trauma. You know, when people go through a traumatic experience together, they band. When there's a crisis, for the most part, we band together, we pull together, and a crisis on that level, I wonder, you know, if it would affect us on a cellular level that deeply enough, where, you know, the theory that we pass our fears on, that as soon as you see big teeth and front-facing eyes. I mean, my children grew up in the city; they never have encountered a wild animal, but they had fears of the stereotypical. So maybe if that we encountered such a cataclysm that was so great that it sunk into our genes that, hey, we need not just a crisis moment, but a crisis several generations of working that out, that where we need to be together, we need to be peaceable, we have no time for conflict, and maybe a big wake-up call, because if we've heard Rogan talk about it after 9/11, how friendly everyone was for a short period of time.
Yeah.
If we had a cosmic event now that wiped out a city, I think we would see the world pull together and wake up to, you know, the real threats and the real dangers, and that would echo beyond just one generation or two. I think.
I think in the context of what we're talking about here, like groups of you know, isolated social groups that would have emerged after a cataclysm like that are going to probably know instinctively that there's a much greater advantage to cooperation than competition. But then you've got 3,000 or 4,000 years of lots of lovemaking and baby making, and the population grows, and because of the warm climate, and we're talking about a climate that's warmer than now. I want that to be clear to anybody who's listening, that the evidence is overwhelming that this period of the hypsothermal or climatic optimum, global temperatures not uniformly everywhere, because there was a lot of local and regional variations, but overall the global temperature was warmer, and sea levels may have been actually 4, 5, 6 feet higher than now. But again, this is all, you know, not everybody doesn't agree on it, but I think that the weight of evidence overwhelmingly shows a warmer world than now.
And when was that?
This would have been that period between 6,000 and 9,000 years ago.
Okay.
Well, and that's you had Dr. Freeman on, and he had discussed how the natives that built the circle, the calendars and the circles that he, you know, believes showed the cardinal directions and line up with the solstices. He had made the comment that, I forget, around the same time, 6,000, 7,000 years, that they were living in the mountains. It was too hot, and the Palliser Triangle was practically a desert. And then when things cooled off is when they finally came out of the mountains and started to spread out to the rest of the prairies.
Yeah, and the paleoclimatologists, the guys who study ancient climate as opposed to, you know, what's going on now, have basically shown that there was, and again, it varied where you were on the Earth, but between like 5,500 and 6,500 years ago, there was a global cooling. They refer to it as the neoglaciation. And there were many places where you had 3,000 or 4,000 years of relatively stable, warm climate, and now suddenly the climate has changed and it's cooled off. And one of the consequences of this, and during this period of warmth, of course, you've got an enormous expansion of the human population. So now with the cooling comes growing season contracts, the elevation at which you can successfully do subsistence farming comes down hundreds of feet. Goes up comes down hundreds of feet, and people that were living in settled communities are suddenly displaced and disrupted by the changes that are taking place. And this is when we actually begin to see fortifications appearing and the weaponry of war and conflict. This is when we see the conflict shows up in the archaeological record right in the wake of this onset of the neoglaciation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's weird. Maybe I'm taking it a little too far out there, but in a sort of scale invariance, maybe I'm doing damage to that term. But in the same way that the planet, might have these cycles of interglacial, glacial, interglacial, it would make sense that we growing up on this planet under the influence of the sun, we would have similar cycles of abundance and peace and order and, control back to when we're eventually, maybe we're getting to this point now where we're kind of swinging back to a little more, I don't know, openness to what's going on and peacefulness and pulling back from that sort of male energy of, like, not man energy, but like that male energy of control and decision and influence.
We're in a position now where we have much more potential of balance between the two. But you see, I think it's a mistake to say that what happened then was just the result of, patriarchy and the desire of men to dominate, because it's much more complicated than that. In some cases, I think it came down to survival of social groups. And, you go, and until somebody's been in a position like that, you don't know what you're capable of. But, I really think that what happens is you have major displacement of human populations and communities between that period of 5,000, 6,000 years ago, which in the astrological context or model would have been the age of Taurus. As the equinox moved into the constellation of Taurus, something interesting happened, just like when it moved into the constellation of Leo 6,000 years earlier than that is when we had this major transition out of the Ice Age, right? Well, we can't really judge, I don't think, until we know what it would be like to see your whole family and community perhaps wiped out. What lengths would you go to preserve your family, your community,
or your life,
or your life? Yeah.
What root does the story of Kronos? What maybe literal root does the story of Kronos eating his children stem from? I mean, in that sense, that the darkness of mankind, when we are driven to it for the need to continue on, there is nothing that would be unacceptable for the survival of the will to go on.
Yeah, I look at it that the whole human species was in effect the victim of these global changes that took place. And to try to blame it and point your finger and say, oh, it was, men, patriarchy. And I think that really takes us off from the fact that we were all humans on this planet were being profoundly affected by these changes that we had no control over at the time.
Yeah. And sorry, I don't mean to I definitely am not blaming men. It's more of that concept that we didn't have the room for the freedom to have feelings and to play around and to just be relaxed. It came down, and you're right. I think for those who could do what needed to get done were the ones that survived. But it took the brutality that is sort of I don't mean specifically exclusive to men, but male energy to take control, to dominate, to partition, to build barracks, to build weapons. And I don't mean that that's a bad thing at all, but just that was that natural swing to the other end, that this is what needed to happen, just as what needed to happen was abundance and fertility previously. Now we're to a point where that's a necessary outcropping. And
now we're in a position where we've created an interconnected global civilization, and we're sitting here having this conversation, right? And we're looking and have access to more information and insight about our own past. I mean, just compare what we have access to now from a generation or two generations ago. I like to make the point that, my grandfather, when he was born, the main mode of transportation on Earth was horseback. So, I mean, and here we are. Look what we're doing here. You know what I mean? Yeah. And this is in a century. Since the scientific revolution, we're looking at 2 or 3 centuries. Now, when you look and consider the fact that modern humans, we've been around for a couple of 100,000 years anyway. Well, who's going to make some definitive final judgment as to what may have transpired or what we may have accomplished in the past that's been totally eradicated and lost? it's easy to do that when you have this uniformitarian gradualistic model of Earth change. But when you finally understand that we live on this extraordinarily dynamic planet that has undergone enormous and amazing and profound convulsions repeatedly just since we humans have been here, it's not something, that only the tinfoil hat boys are going to speculate about. I mean, it really becomes plausible that there could have been all kinds of things going on that have been utterly lost and essentially erased, except for mythology and epic tales and symbolism and things like that. And I think
that's where the Giza part comes in on this, where they're leaving this knowledge of these events and the cycles which these events occur. That's kind of where my work comes in to play.
Because what if I'm understanding what you've done is you've established a sort of chronometer.
Yeah.
If you will. And it's linked into the great year cycle, the precessional cycle. And without really knowing the details of your work, it seems that totally complements what I've been thinking for years and quite a number of other researchers that this great year model is somehow used to encapsulate a lot of this information about the tempo of these great changes that have taken place. And when you begin to look at the symbolism of the what I call the cosmic cross, which I think is the basis of all of the cross symbolism of ancient times, including Christianity, because now you realize what the cosmic cross was the same thing, whether it was Native American people, whether it was the Mayans, whether it was the pre-Christians, the Mithraists. The cross or the Celts, this cross represented the cosmic cross, which was the solstitial line and the equinoctial line, which in its turning marks out the tempo of the cosmic change that is governing the terrestrial change. And they knew this. And this is why it played such an important role in so many of the symbologies that we've inherited from the ancient world. And there's a tempo there that, you found it, and Daven, you're probably aware of how the numbers that are associated with this precessional cycle are the numbers we find recurring over and over again in the sacred geometry, in the ancient, in the sacred architecture. They built these numbers into the plans, in the elevations of the ancient sacred structures. All over the world, they built these same numbers or variants
or expressed them in different architectural styles, still encoding these same numbers.
And it turns out that those numbers have a basis in real world astronomy and real world celestial motion. And why were they so obsessed and fixated on celestial motion, building structures that could serve as observatories for celestial motion? Well, I think there's multiple reasons, but one of the primary reasons would be that
to mark this trajectory that we're on, that shows how these cycles happen. Now, they're not all. There's these events can be random in nature too, that can throw things in there that don't necessarily line up with certain dates. But there are these cyclical events, right? Like 5,200 years ago, we talked about essentially, the beginning of the Mayan calendar, 3114 BC.
Listen, 5,200 years ago, there's multiple places around the Earth that have carbonaceous layers, which would suggest a period of enormous wildfires. And I'm not aware yet of particularly cosmic impact markers yet, but I'm pretty confident they're going to show up when people start looking. Yeah, at 4,300 also, same thing. And there are cosmic impact markers showing up then. And I think, again, what we're seeing is that the evidence is showing that the interactions between Earth and the cosmos have occurred with a much greater frequency than anybody had imagined even a few decades ago.
Yes.
And now we're kind of, in a way, confronted with this new knowledge. And in a sense, to me, it's like almost like a wake-up call. It's like, okay, listen, if you people want to keep going with this thing you've got going on down there, you need to start looking at the bigger picture and start acting like grown-ups down there and quit all that squabbling and ridiculous. That's all just distracting us from...
Yes.
And that's one of the things that I don't know, I find, I shouldn't say disheartening because change comes slowly. I guess when I was younger, I expected it to come quicker, but I talked to some people, like I was mentioning earlier, friends that I know, and it doesn't seem to resonate quite as much with them. And I know that it's so easy to get stuck in, the day-to-day and the grind and who's on TV. But to me, these are fundamental things, not just the revelation that we could have been more organized before than we thought, that the human history doesn't begin with cuneiform writing, and the larger implications of that about this being about the survival of our species, the survival of our well-being, and that we have the knowledge, we have the manpower, we have the resource, we just seem to lack the focus. And it's unfortunate because I think, all those friends that I have, if Hollywood or whoever was, if they were making that attractive instead of global warming, like you look how much they have pushed global warming and the questionable. I mean, I've said to my friends, and again, I get met with the same sort of look, but after listening to you and what they've discussed on No Agenda, they talk about it quite a lot, Adam Curry and John C. Dvorak, that, if it's questionable whether it's really taking place, how much impact do we have? You keep hearing things like carbon impact, and carbon takes up what is 0.1% of our atmosphere, and that's supposed to have some incredible influence. But if I've said to friends that if global warming, I hope global warming is real. I hope that man actually can influence the environment that much, because if we don't push it over the line, we want things to be warm. Mankind has always done better when it's warm.
Yes.
And this being the longest interglacial period on record, why wouldn't we want to stretch this out again ad infinitum? Why would we not want to have that ability? So I don't believe we do have that control over the environment. I think, like Carlin said, we might mess it up for us, but I mean, she's going to recover. She's met with worse than anything we can do, but it's...
Yeah,
distractions and money and profit.
Yeah, and if we could
that's what you got to look at this stuff. You quit. Don't even engage in some of the arguments. Sometimes it's just distracting us from the stuff, the kind of work that Randall's doing, and getting to the meat of this stuff and saying, hey, folks, we're arguing about this little stuff over here, and we got this going on. You better start paying attention to this, because this looks cyclical in nature.
Yeah,
and let's look at the cyclical nature of it, and let's,
and that too, to me, would only make sense again. Like the seasons, I know our seasons on this planet are because of the axial tilt, but it would make complete sense that we would, as we go, everything is so tied and so interwoven. There's nothing in the universe that doesn't touch itself. So it makes complete sense that we would be going through seasons of a fall and a
cosmic season,
right?
Seasons, yes,
right.
And that, like we discussed earlier, how do you pass that information on? If you can't pass it on through stone, then you've got to go to the stars, because
the
that's
asterisms,
the
constellations. That's how they did it.
Yes,
that's exactly what I was going to try to show you here tonight. But yes, that's exactly what they did. They're mapping the trajectory and the alignments of our movement through space. And they're saying, hey, at certain points in this motion, the shit hits the fan. And this calendar that we're looking at ties into exactly these geological disruptions.
Yeah.
And maybe not all of them. There's obviously just erratic episodes, different just wanders or whatever that don't work in a cycle, that can really muddy up the waters.
That can muddy up the water.
And get the, but there's major ones in there that we need to look at, and they're at alignments. I mean, we talked about the great year here. Well, what I've found here in this great year, if you align that great year to end in 2012, which is a galactic alignment. Now, if you go on Stellarium or wherever your star program is there and view from the Sphinx and look west or east, and see the alignments that happen on that date of 2012. First of all, sunrise, from the Sphinx, you're looking at the sun with the galaxy right behind it. Well, if you were
make the point that this is happening at winter solstice.
Yes, December 21st,
and it's actually happening in the years leading up to and leading out of 2012.
Yes. This isn't just like one day and everything comes to an end and all that.
The motion of this point is 50 arc seconds per year.
Yeah,
so that's going to be relatively
right. And bear in mind, this is all in a moving frame here, so we're just kind of capturing this motion. But we had talked earlier before about how things aren't exactly perfect. Right. That they vary, and it shows in the music, in the adjusting the tuning of the music to work, and the adjustment of the measurements, and that's this adjustment that needs to be added into these numbers for the galactic alignment.
There's the ideal, the platonic ideal, if you want to call it that, and then there's the real world. Right. And it's just like as a builder and craftsman, you know this, I know this, that when you go to build a project, and I've got the blueprints in front of me, the blueprints are an idealized version of the finished project, right? Yes. And as we talked about, there's always going to be a discrepancy between what the architect shows on the blueprints and the final structure that you build. The amount of discrepancy is really the measure of the degree of skill and craftsmanship of the builder, if you will, right? But what happens is once the structure's done, now the vagaries of time begin to go to work on it. And so when you're looking at it in the aftermath down the road, it's going to have a greater discrepancy than the day it was finished. Right. But so what you've got is the blueprint is the idealized version, and then the structure, the actual structure is the real world. Well, in Freemasonry, I think one of the fundamental premises of how that whole system works is this idea of the great architect of the universe, also sometimes referred to as the grand geometrician, who laid out the universe and all of its workings according to this template of geometry. Once you understand the template in its idealized form, you can then look at the actual structure, say, of like our own solar system, and realize that it's very, very close, but it's not exact. So, your reductionist skeptic would look at that and use that as the rationale for dismissing the whole thing. Right? The fact that Jupiter's orbit is maybe a week off from being the ideal number of 10,800 days, right? Mm-hmm. But there is very close to this amazing synchrony between all of the celestial objects, a celestial symphony, if you will. Right. I suspect that somehow within that matrix is also the tempo for the delivery of cosmic material to the inner solar system, where it can become Earth crossing, if you will. Yeah. And I think to get to the ultimate source of that tempo, we have to go to the galactic level. Yes. Because as we were talking about, I think it's discontinuities on the galactic level that basically dislodge the comets, disrupt the stability of the Oort cloud and the primarily the Oort cloud. The Oort cloud is this huge shell of billions, hundreds of billions of comets that reaches out, several light years away from our sun. And within that, you have a concentration of comets into the plane of the ecliptic, which is called the Kuiper disk. And what happens is, I think that on the comets in the Oort cloud level are being disrupted by or sent into disequilibrium by events on a galactic scale. Yeah, I think perhaps nearby supernovas, perhaps, in the Paul Violette concept of galactic core explosions. But then you have the Kuiper disk, which reaches almost into the orbit of Neptune. And at that point, I think the big outer planets become the dominant influence. And the was that you that you showed the how the moon slingshotted that asteroid back into space? Yeah. Well, alignments of the outer planets and encounters between, first of all, Uranus and Neptune can do that same phenomenon. They can either accelerate the orbit of a comet, because the Kuiper disk and the Oort cloud they're orbiting, they're rotating, revolving is the proper term, revolving around the sun very slowly. Uranus and Neptune, let's say they conjunct, so the gravity fields combine. A cometary object just in advance of them, that gravity influence is going to have a retarding or braking effect. If it's in front of them, it's going to accelerate. If it accelerates it, just like you showed me on that video, it sends it flying out. If it decelerates it, it drops in a shell and comes within the gravitational sphere of the planets, which happens that the 4 giant outer planets are exactly spaced right. That if you changed the spacing or you changed the masses of them, they could not effectively transfer comets from the inner edge of the Kuiper disk to the inner solar system as they do now. In fact, some researchers have called it a celestial bucket brigade. You see, and so there again, we get to this fact that our solar system happens to almost be designed to deliver these packages of fundamental materials to the inner solar system, where they would then have the chance of encountering a planet that happens to be just the requisite distance from the sun, with the requisite mass, not too great a mass, not too less a mass, to deliver the water. And then you have to have a moon, because without a moon, you don't have an intertidal zone. Without an intertidal zone, you are not going to be able to get more primitive marine life up to become air-breathing land life. Without the moon, you don't have the intertidal zone, you see.
Well, and when I first heard you discuss that, what I thought of was, again, like these just larger, the same patterns being played out on a larger scale, in that, you're going, if panspermia exists, that it's almost like it's nudging. Every once in a while, these seeds are being sort of falling towards the sun, and sometimes they may hit infertile ground. And how many every years the cycle continues again, and more seeds are cast, and now this time it happens to be fertile ground. Maybe it's Mars, and maybe it doesn't take hold, maybe something doesn't take place. But eventually, again, this seasons, enough cycles take place where, like you say, it hits that Goldilocks, it hits that sweet spot. And again, now to shrinking it down a little smaller, maybe that's where we are, with it's enough sweet spots to get eventually to this point where maybe we can keep this little rock safe. I always used to say we need to expand. After listening to Bill Hicks, I said, we need to get off this rock. We got to expand. We got to get off this rock. And I think that is of primary importance, but also we really do have to start paying attention to what's going on as a globe. And that's why, like you say, cosmic civilization, global civilization, whatever, we really do have to focus on the fact that if we do things right here, we've got lots of abundance. We don't need to fight. And there's way bigger problems out there that that don't care about our religion, that don't care about our language barriers, that don't care about our belief systems.
The next half-kilometer object out there that's already in an orbit that's going to bring it into direct impact with Earth, and they're out there, more than one, we just haven't found them yet, is going to, completely change our priorities. Mm-hmm. But what you're saying, I totally think that it is the life's genetic imperative to become cosmic.
Right.
I think the seeds were planted on this Earth. The Earth serves as the matrix for the development of higher life forms that now can return life to the cosmos from whence it came, but in a highly transmuted form, a highly transformed with brains and foresight and self-awareness.
And that our migration didn't just end with the trek out of Africa, that there's always, and I'm getting too far out of here, which I have a tendency to do.
Go for it, man.
I think that this is almost seems to be so written into our nature that I would argue that somewhere else this has taken place all over, that it almost just seems to be written into the fabric of the universe, that it's almost as if we're composed of stardust, but we're questioning the nature of what is existence. It seems to be where we are. What does it mean to exist? And wasn't it The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where they built the giant computer, and they asked it the question, the meaning of life? And I kind of wonder if that's not what the universe is doing, and that the universe has sort of spawned us, these little intellectual beings, that on some scale it's trying to resolve its own existence, because the universe is very much, in a way, a living thing. It's still growing. It's still expanding. I mean, it's I don't know. And when you look at how so many of the numbers, the little bits of sacred geometry that I've started to wander into, there seems to be such a fundamental tie to the numbers of it across all of the scales.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there absolutely is.
I mean, even if you look at how vast the universe is and how little matter there is that we know of, at least, and how that's a perfect reflection of the small scale. When you get in so close, we don't touch ourselves. There's so little matter contained within ourselves. It's just that everything seems to be a constant pattern repeating itself over and over. And whether it's emotion or thought or music or architecture that seems to be a nice fundamental groundwork to everything. Which sort of, I wouldn't mind if we can just go down this path a little bit with the stuff we were discussing about the moon earlier.
I was going to get into that. I wanted people want to hear you talk about the moon, I think, as well.
Oh, they do. Well,
apparently you're going to give us a book at some point.
Well, yeah, you have to wait and buy the book.
Yeah.
Well, I did bring up the moon in the fundamental role that the moon plays. But yeah, there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, the moon is a rather strange object in our night sky, and I don't think there's an easy explanation for it. But yeah, I mean, I mean, the moon is basically not behaving itself as it should within the laws of Newtonian physics. Shouldn't. You know, it's
Well, watching that video that I showed you, that little clip where it showed that the meteor spinning around a few times, that was, like I said, to me, the wake-up call that, oh, wow, the moon serves, besides tidal, the moon actually serves some other functions, and that it can help eject some of these predators that are coming to wipe us out.
Yes, it can do that. We just saw that. That was one of the best things I've seen in a while. That was great.
My job here is done. I'm out.
Can you explain why it doesn't behave within the laws of Newtonian physics?
Well, the first clue is the fact that no matter what time of year, what time of month, or what time of day you go out and observe the moon, you're always going to see the same face. So then I ask the question to people who've never thought about this for 1 second before, what does that mean? And then the most common response I get is, oh, well, the moon isn't rotating. Is that the correct response? Is that the correct answer? No, because if it was not rotating, we would see one face, say, at one point, and 2 weeks later, after it had circled halfway around the Earth, we'd be looking at the opposite face, if it was not rotating.
Right.
But it is, in fact, I should have posed this question to you, Graham, to see if you gave the standard response, but
I would have passed.
Oh, you would have passed. Okay.
My wife's a teacher, and when she was in university and doing her practicum, she had to teach a science course, and we were going over this, and I was helping her because she asked me, and it was the first time, I was ashamed to admit how old I was, that I really had contemplated, well, why is it that we always see the same side of the moon? And I literally had to take a flashlight and set it on the table and take a cup that was the Earth and take another cup was the moon, and had to rotate the Earth and rotate the moon at the same time to fully clue into how it works. And that just the balance is so perfect there.
To put it simply, what we would say is that the rotation of the moon on its axis is precisely the same as its revolution about the Earth. What has been referred to as one-to-one spin orbit coupling. One-to-one spin orbit coupling.
Now, this is rare for moons, isn't it?
Well, because we only see one moon, we only have really one example. It's not when you get into the small, like when we look at Phobos and Deimos of Mars, we see the same thing. But they're much smaller objects, and they don't have sufficient mass to aggregate to sphericality and a radial and homogeneous distribution of mass about the center of gravity. Because if they did that, you see, then the Earth's gravity field has no ability to lock into, or should I turn around? The moon then would not lock into Earth's gravity field. And see, that's basically what's happened, is that the moon is locked into Earth's gravity field, and which tells us that the moon's internal mass is not strictly radially symmetrical, nor is it homogeneous. Because if it was, its mass would act as a single point, and Earth's gravity field would not have the ability to lock it in to that phased relationship, that one-to-one spin orbit coupling. What that means is basically there's two moments of inertia in the moon that are distributed towards the surface of the moon rather than as center. And the best way I could show that is I could demonstrate it here in the studio if Daven will pick up that pen there. I want you to, and maybe we could do
You can write on the table too if you want.
Oh, okay. Yeah. If you just hold this in one spot right in the middle, okay. Now you hold that as tight as you can, and prevent me. I'm gonna set the mic down for a second, and what I'm gonna do is you're holding it in one point, and I'm gonna take it, and you try to keep it from turning. See how easy that was?
Yeah.
For me to turn it, right?
I thought I was strong.
Yeah. See, this is. But now, so here you've got this moment of inertia coinciding with the center of gravity. Now hold it in 2 points, like this. Now keep me from rotating it.
Yeah.
You see what's happening there? That's a clue. It's a clue that the internal structure of the moon is not radially symmetrical. It's distributed outside of the center of mass. Now, here's the other. Now, why is that bizarre? Well, it's bizarre because if we look at what we know about the moon, it's a low-density object. It's just slightly over half the density, the mean density of Earth, which, I'm thinking is about 5.6, compared to like water is 1 gram per cubic centimeter. I think the average density of the Earth is about 5.6 grams per cubic centimeter. And that's average density because the crust of the Earth is lower than that and the core of the Earth is higher than that. Core of the Earth is, heavy, dense, most comparable to like an extremely dense iron core, right? The moon's overall density, though, is very low, you see. So the moon should actually be much more plastic than the Earth, which means that over enough period of time, and the moon's overall mass is enough that its molecular structure should have aggregated into the geometric form that provides the least resistance or the least energy to maintain per volume, which is a sphere. Because just a cube would require much more energy to maintain that shape than a sphere of the same mass, right? So the internal structure of and see if things are low density enough and they're large enough, they're all going to eventually settle out to the shape of a sphere. Once they do that and the mass becomes radially distributed about the center of gravity, then it's just like there's one moment of inertia, and at that point the moon would be completely free to rotate about any axis independent of the Earth's gravity field. But it hasn't done that. Over eons of time, the moon has not settled out to the geometry of minimum energy potential, which would be spherical. And the fact that it has this line locked into the surface of the Earth is demonstrating that to us. Well, then what does that in turn clue us into about the internal structure of the moon? Then when you couple that with the fact that the moon seems to be highly resistant to even the most violent and large impacts, which the Maria, which, if you look at the moon, there's a asymmetric distribution of surface features on the moon. Like if you look at the backside of the moon, there's only one small Maria, but the near side, the Earth side of the moon, half of the moon is taken up by these great gray splotches, which are the basaltic Maria, which are like the lava outflows from these gigantic impacts. Well, we were talking earlier about the scaling ratio between width and depth of impact craters, and typically you might go that the depth is going to be 1/10 the width. So if you have a crater like on Earth, which of equivalent density to an object of equivalent density to the Earth, and it's 30 miles wide, its depth is going to be about 3 miles. If it's 10 miles wide, its depth is going to be about a mile, right? Now, of course, there's a lot of variation on that depending on the density of the target rock, the density of the impacting object, the velocity, the angle of approach. All of those are going to be variables that change that. But just as a rough, order of magnitude concept here. Well, when you go to talk about the moon, what you see is that the scaling ratios apply up to about 30, 40 miles in diameter, and they keep getting deeper consistently as the craters get wider. But then once they get beyond about 30, 40 miles, they continue to get wider, they don't get deeper. So that some of the big craters, if you were to actually place an astronaut at the center of those craters that have, might have mountain rims that are a mile high, 2 miles high, place at the center, they wouldn't even see the rim because it would be below the horizon, because that curvature of the moon's outer surface is still there. It's like somehow the moon has this ability to resist these great impacts that should have just, excavated, if you look at some Mare Imbrium or some of these big mare, you should have had, dozens of miles deep, but they're not.
And that goes back to the density not being in the center?
It goes back to the thing that suggests that the moon is anomalously rigid in its structure, and it's also anomalously strong in its outer layers. And another clue that it's anomalously strong in its outer layers was the discovery of mascons in the early days of moon exploration. You know what a mascon is? It's short for mass concentration. And Graham is getting on the computer there. You're looking up mascons?
I was just typing in a note. But I can look it up if you want.
Well, mascons, I can tell you what they are. You can look them up, but they're short for mass concentrations. Mass concentrations are large density somethings that are just below the surface of the moon. And how they discovered them was in the first lunar orbiters that were sent around. As they're going along, they would pass over the mascons and they would actually be deflected downward in their pathway. Like that there's some large hidden objects of extraordinary density just below the surface of the moon, right? Now, again, this is anomalous because just like in the models of regular planetary formation, the densest material migrates to the center where it all consolidates and then becomes radially symmetrical. Whereas in the moon, it's just like, imagine you took a lead pellet and put it on a bowl full of pudding. It's going to sit there for a minute, but it's going to eventually sink to the bottom, isn't it? Right? Well, just, like on the Earth, if you took something of a mean density, a huge object of mean density, 7 or 8 grams or more per cubic centimeter, 10, 12 grams per cubic centimeter, it's going to sink right into the Earth, right? Some of the material of the degenerate star Sirius B, let's say, I believe, would weigh up to 50 tons per cubic inch, something along those lines. If you had something of that density and set it on the Earth, it would sink right immediately to the core. But over time, something of extreme density is going to sink to the core of the Earth. And it should likewise sink to the core of the moon, but it hasn't. Which again suggests that the outer structure of the moon is extremely rigid because it's supporting these mascons. And how long have the mascons been there? It's been proposed that maybe the mascons are remnants of large iron asteroids that struck the moon, but the problem is that the energy released in an impact of that scale would basically utterly demolish and even volatilize the impacting object, and it wouldn't leave. So these mascons are mysterious. What they are, nobody knows for sure, but it provides evidence that the outer structure of the moon is extremely strong.
Well, and that's one thing in our discussion earlier, I thought might be useful to clarify is I was using the term dense, that when discussing the craters and how they would stop going as deep and would start to just widen out. I said, well, it's denser in the middle, but no, you corrected me. It's not that it's denser. It's just that it's rigid. Something doesn't need to be dense to be strong. So what's at the core of the moon that's taking extra impact is not denser. It's just more rigid.
Well, I think the models of the moon now suggest that there is a very dense, very anomalously small core. But then what you have is an anomalously small core, and you have this outer rigid structure,
the
shell, if you will. And then what's in between
That's the question.
And there I think that what we're looking at, perhaps, is that there is some type of architecture in there that adds additional rigidity to that outer shell. And in our discussion earlier, the architecture that I invoked was that of a beehive.
Honeycomb. I was thinking the same thing.
A honeycomb.
Wow.
Yeah, a honeycomb. You were thinking that. See, so it's already... See, we already have that. You proved, Graham, that we already have this knowledge in our genes.
Yeah.
See, right? Well, and bees and honeycombs are a very big part of a lot of esoteric traditions. So you look at any of the old Masonic lodges from the 17 and 1800s, and some of these old Masonic carpets and stuff with all the whole panoply of Masonic symbolism, you'll always see a honeycomb, the bees flying around it, and usually juxtaposed just above it or in the immediate vicinity of it is the lunar crescent. And then also associated with that, you also find another very potent symbol, the anchor. See, and you think about the anchor, the shape of the, see, well, we can say for one thing, like the moon has been often referred to as the ship of the night, right? And when you look at the crescent of the moon, it's very suggestive of a ship-like form, right? And it's anchored to the earth by this gravitational tether, you see. And the image of the anchor is very interesting because you look at it, it's the cross, and then it's the crescent. You see, it's the cross rising up out of the crescent. And the cross, as I've said before, I think is a symbol of basically this whole concept of death and resurrection. And it was incorporated into the early symbolism of Christianity, but pre-existed Christianity by a long time, the symbolism of the cross. And then in the astronomical sense, that refers us to the great cosmic cross, which is the equinoctial line and the solstitial line at right angles to it, that's rotating at this 26,000-year great year cycle that perhaps is the thing that at least is the clock that gives us the tempo of when we can expect these non-linearities, these points of discontinuity within the system.
Well, and to me, it would make sense in the way that I felt a lot of the marking of the solstice. I have speculated, just, random average Joe speculating that it was very important to people to mark that, to know when the sun was coming, to know when we were returning to light, just to know that things were in alignment, that things were okay, the cycle was okay, and to mark that. And so these larger cycles, if we gained recognition of them, it makes complete sense to me that we would want to try and mark down and note these larger cycles in whatever way possible. And it's so unfortunate that our ways are so limited that we can't just send ourselves an email to the future or a sticky note and just have it stay there for 15,000 years just in case.
The sticky notes wouldn't have lasted as long as the pyramids, so that's probably why they didn't do that. But all this stuff is in the record, and it's a lot of it is right at Giza. These markers, that they put in are alignments that happen within the trajectory and motion of our sun, Sirius system, Pleiades system. And what I found, and I put in the article, Leo Orion relationship, is that these movements are based out of the M42 nebula in Orion, Orion's sword. The spiral of Barnard's loop is actually that geometry demonstrated in the light of the plasma loop of Barnard's loop, that this is moving in this, and it's related to the galactic center alignment, and it's clearly in the record there. But it's interesting too, especially we got talking a little bit about that point before, talking about the Mayan hearthstones. The whole Mayan tradition is marked around these three stars in Orion, and with the center of the fire, the hearth fire, the smoke, is the M42 nebula. And they talk about how their whole tradition is built around it. And that's where this spiral is emanating from, that they've put at Giza. Perhaps,
when you said that, I'm thinking of supernovas now, and that what we were talking about earlier, that perhaps that there is a rhythm to
consider the
supernova events.
Consider this. I mean, the M42 nebula is a star birthing nebula. Okay, and if we know that these stars are being ejected out of that nebula. Well, as with any other kind of pattern in life and cycles, there are cyclical nature to the birthing of these stars. So what I've discovered here in this the map at Giza there is showing that these are spirals, that the Sirius system and the Pleiades and the sun are actually moving away from that point of origin in a spiral motion, in a spiral arm of the Orion, or the Orion arm in the spiral galaxy. I mean, it really totally makes sense, and many of the cultures point to that, those specific star groups and the Orion Nebula. And it's really interesting to see how this plays out, because the the way they wrote it in the asterisms and how it works along with the template, there's really not an argument to it. It's so beautifully drawn and mapped out that this needs to be looked at, and that's what I'm hoping on this trip of Randall with you, that we can get together and look at this and see how it fits right intimately with your observations geologically.
Well, that's what's happening here. I mean, there's a lot of people around have been doing this kind of work for years now. I started it, like I said, 1969. I got obsessed, and I've been obsessed pretty much ever since. But, a lot of this is just coming together now. People have been, in isolation, sometimes, within mainstream academia, oftentimes not. But, these pieces are coming together, and what's emerging is a very interesting and awesome picture of our situation here. It's a lot more amazing than
the ramifications and implications are just amazing.
David, didn't you mention the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy too? Is it a coincidence that he's talking about 42, the answer to universe, life, and everything? Maybe he's found it in the nebula.
Well, I mean, that's what they all talk about, right? That's where the pharaohs would return to Orion, right? Well, it makes sense here just to look at it as if it's a star-birthing nebula, and we can see a spiral emanating from that, which is Barnard's Loop. It's a plasma gas
ejection.
Yeah, and when we do a long exposure film, you can see that. But what's really amazing then whoever did this at Giza obviously had the ability and understanding of how they could see that spiral and know it.
Well, you'll have to show me this.
Yeah, I would really love to. It's
that reminds me, isn't it the Gnostic belief of the origins of the Earth was a burst from the center of the galaxy that was created? Sophia was responsible. I'll have to read up on my Gnostic. I forget one of the podcasts I listened to. They all start to blend together, and
Well, this will be when you see how this fits together, and you see how many loose ends this ties up and explains without the need. I mean, okay, we'll get into the precession discussion here a little bit. Now, traditionally, it's been explained as a wobble of the Earth, but there's a major problem with that, and everybody knows it, and kind of just, what's the alternative? And the reason that's not the case is because when you measure that wobble against anything in our solar system, it's not measurable. That's a major problem. We should be, if we're just wobbling ourselves, we should easily, well, I shouldn't say easily, it's only been recently with the higher technical tools to measure that close. They can't measure that wobble within the solar system. They also can't measure it really, well, I shouldn't say they can't measure it, but it's very small measure is Sirius, and the Pleiades also don't precess. Okay, well, it's just a logical thought here that these three are tied together, and if they're all moving in a spiral motion away from each other, this would give you the effect. Our view on Earth would look like a wobble, but it's not. It's actually almost picture the rolling a wheel along a spiral. So the wheel is rolling along a spiral, and that's what's giving us this view that looks like a wobble, but it's really not. And I want to try to get this in front of people who have the tools to really analyze this. And
it sounds like we need a three-dimensional model.
Yes,
to really visualize this.
Yeah, I do have some two-dimensional stuff, but to look at it, it's actually pretty clear how this could make sense.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Pleiades in Sirius, because in my work I've encountered both of them on several different occasions. Pleiades in particular, go back, we were talking earlier about the Tunguska event, right? Well, do you know the date that it occurred on? You know the date?
1908?
That was the year. What was the That was, what was the date? What day did that?
October?
No,
August. It was August.
no,
I had a 1 in 12.
Okay. Well,
June 30th.
Okay.
Okay, June 30th. Okay, now, do you know what time of day it happened? Do you guys out there know? What time of day? What? About 7:14, early in the morning. Thank you, Darren.
Darren, I like it.
Yeah. I think I'm starting to lose it a little bit here.
yeah,
but,
I'm going on no sleep myself. I
Yeah.
hear you.
We'll finish up soon, guys. Yeah.
The listeners have to understand we've been on the road for a couple of days with very little sleep here, and we're pushing the envelope here. But about 7:14 in the morning, and many of the eyewitnesses described it as if it was being disgorged from the sun, or that it was being spun off of the sun, because it came from the direction of the sun early in the morning, from the southeast, traveling towards the northwest. So the sun was rising June 30th relative to that area of Siberia. It came directly from the direction of the sun. So we have two things to go on. We know the direction it came from, and we know the time of the year. Well, June 30th is the peak of the summertime Taurid meteor shower,
Yes.
right? And we would be crossing that as the stream, which is going outside the orbit of Jupiter, coming back inside, think of an ellipse, where the two foci of the ellipse are the sun and Jupiter. And you've got this stream rotating around, and then within that, you've got the Earth's orbit that crosses that stream twice each year. Okay, so it crosses the stream as it's coming from the sun, coming and going away from the sun, and it crosses the stream again as the material is coming back towards the sun. Now, when it crosses the stream, when the stuff is coming away from the sun, you would have to look towards the sun to see it coming. And that's why they didn't see it, you see. Now, wait till around the end of October and the beginning of November, and the Earth is now crossing the stream again, but now it's coming in from Jupiter, right? And if you were to look at the stream, upstream at that point, every meteor stream has what's called the radiant point in space, which is the point in space where the meteor stream appears to be emerging or emanating out of the night sky. The radiant, R-A-D-I-A-N-T, radiant, okay? So it's almost like you're looking up at a tunnel with perspective. Everybody's walked down railroad tracks, and you know how the parallel railroad tracks seem to converge in the distance. Picture, but now you're in a tunnel. It looks like it converges in a distance. And in that tunnel, you have all these meteoritic pieces flying down this tunnel. And as we cross it, we can look up that tunnel and we see that stuff flying towards us. You know, in a few days, we'll have the peak of the Perseid meteor shower. Well, I said the Taurid meteor shower, the Perseid meteor shower, you have the Leonids, you have the Scorpiids, you have the Geminids. Well, all of those meteor showers are named after the constellations from which they appear to emanate.
Radiate out of there.
So when we talk about the Taurid meteor shower, what constellation are we talking about?
Taurus.
Taurus, yes. Now, here's what's interesting. What forms in the constellation, you should know this, Ed, if in the constellation of Taurus, what forms the shoulder of the bull?
The plate. Yeah, he's looking at me. Well,
Yes.
what's really interesting, if you draw, if that in the asterism, okay, if you do a certain view there of that, the line that creates the asterism that points out the Pleiades, if you follow that line straight across, it points directly to Sirius.
No. You're going to have to show me that, too.
And not only that, when you do that, it actually crosses and intersects the star Regulus in the
Orion.
Well, and see, the significance of that
There's two
is
views going on here.
Regulus is my rising sign, my rising
All right.
star. Yeah.
There you go.
Right under
There
the
you
horizon.
go. There you go.
Right under the horizon.
That's a really
heart
critical
of the
thing that was
light. I like
marking it marks the ecliptic.
Yeah.
It
Marks
rides the ecliptic.
Yes,
Exactly.
marks the ecliptic.
That's what's important about Regulus and Leo. That's why they use that asterism.
Okay, and now we've got two of the great meteor streams of history are the Taurids and the Leonids.
Right. Right. And that's what they're marking in this cycle. It's
So
really amazing.
When you go out on, and this is why actually the Taurids have been referred to as the Halloween meteors, because they peak right on Halloween, the day up to and the day, and very interesting work done. And I've written about this some. I think I've got several articles somewhere about this, but I've done several presentations on the origin of the Day of the Dead, which was a universal tradition from all over the world that typically was celebrated commensurate with our Halloween. And let's see, who was the Robert Grant Halliburton, I believe, was the researcher back in the 1920s who first started doing research into the origins of the Day of the Dead and discovered that it was universal all around the planet, and that it was very similar, celebrated. And so our Halloween is basically consistent with this universally celebrated Day of the Dead, the Feast of the Ancestors, which in his research disclosed the idea that the origin of it, he saw it as in biblical terms, that it went back to Noah's flood, which is interesting because if you look at Noah's flood in the description of there, you see that in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, in the 17th day of the month, and then if you figure that the Hebrew sacred calendar was based upon the fall equinox, you can then look at Scorpio as being traditionally the astrological sign of death, and then this coming very close to that period, which would have been the 17th day of the month, would have been very close to our modern day Halloween. And
which would mean the Taurid meteor shower again?
Yes, and bringing us the peak of the Taurid meteor shower.
Wow.
Right.
And Halliburton's idea was that the reason for the universality of it was that people all over the world witnessed the same thing, which is the influx of the Taurid meteor shower, which in older times would have been much, much more active than it is now. And there is a group of British astronomers and neo-catastrophists, Victor Klube and William Napier and a few others that have been researching the Taurid meteor shower for decades now and are convinced that not only was there enormous mass of material in the Taurid shower in ancient times which could have encountered the Earth, there probably still is that we haven't discovered yet.
Now, is this is it a phenomenon because people are seeing just these things fly through the sky, or is it because some of them would actually enter our atmosphere and hit Earth? Like
both,
yeah,
both.
Exactly.
And so what they would have been what they would have experienced was this incredible celestial light show at the same time near these extreme terrestrial consequences.
Wow.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting.
And you can certainly see how that would shape people. Hey, look, there was a whole new religion that was spawned in the wake of the Tunguska event. Yeah, and they felt that this was the visitation of the fire god Agdi to Earth to punish mankind for his sins. And so there was a whole new religion spawned up there in Siberia based around that event. And when Leonid Kulik first tried to get there, he discovered that nobody wanted to take him into that region because they believed that it was accursed and that, it was part of their religious belief that this was off limits. They didn't go there. And actually, let's see, at some point I remember I read somewhere, I think that the first guides he hired that took him in there, they freaked out and left, and then were eventually killed. Wow! When they for such a transgression, but you can imagine what would a multiple Tunguska type event, and that's exactly what this school of British neo-catastrophism is invoking, which is that we might have periods of bombardment where there may be multiple Tunguska events happening simultaneously or over a short span of time. Which collectively would have extreme consequences for those of us down here.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So
there's a link with the Pleiades right there. So if people start talking about Pleiadians, you might want to say, well, maybe you should consider that aliens from Pleiades may actually be the debris of this ancient giant comet. And that's probably, and it certainly was the debris of a giant comet that probably no longer exists, a progenitor comet of which Comet Encke and Comet Rudnicki are remnants. But they're in that stream, and there's several asteroids, I think Oljato and several others that are also identified as being members of that family, that great stream of debris that Earth crosses twice each year.
And that's exactly what those markers are pointing out, these constellations that we're talking about here. Exactly.
Well, you've sold me. You've sold me. I want to look at it.
Yeah,
I want to sit.
I want to present this at the Paradigm Symposium there.
Well, I'll be there
a little bit, but
Yeah,
hopefully
I'll be right in the front row heckling.
What are you going to be presenting, Randall? Some of this stuff here from your current.
I haven't made up my mind yet. I don't know. I'm just waiting to get a contract yet to see what. Yeah. I still don't know. I was.
You got a lot of content to sift through and decide what you're gonna do.
Yeah, of course, there'd be a lot of visuals.
So I got a quick question for you before we wrap up here.
Okay.
And thanks for joining us, Daven.
Hey, thank you.
I don't want to keep you guys up.
Yeah, really, man. Thanks, Daven.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, me too. That was some great stuff.
I don't want to
brought
keep
in.
you up for too long here, but just before, in case we don't get to do this on your way back after your trip, I have a personal question for you.
Okay.
You being a Freemason and stuff, I was interested. Isn't there a prerequisite of a belief in a supreme deity or a higher power?
Well,
I wanted to know what your thought.
The thing is that the whole system is predicated upon the universe as being a work of architecture, right?
Yeah.
And so the way the ritualism is structured is it's almost like that's the cornerstone of the whole thing. The belief that there is an intelligence, an ultimate intelligence behind the whole thing, and if you want to bring that into some kind of a coherent vision that you can actually grasp, you have to, and bring it out of the realm of just pure abstraction.
Yep.
The metaphor that they've used is the grand architect, or the great architect, or the grand geometrician, and without that, at least that premise as part of your belief system, the rest of it really doesn't make sense. I mean, that's like the axiom upon which the whole system is developed. So
for your personal belief, it's kind of that's where the sacred geometry comes in a way?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because for me, it was always, as a young child, I just instinctively believed that there was some kind of order to things and some kind of, then I kind of fell away from that. And of course, then I came back via the route that many of us did back in the 60s and became convinced that there was, in fact, something more than meets the eye, both to inner space, to the world around us, to outer space, and then began to, kind of go off on this journey, this quest for knowledge that took me, all over the place and down many different belief systems. And I was led into Freemasonry because I kept encountering it, because as I was learning and developing my craft of building, I was very interested in the history of architecture, and you can't study the history of architecture without stumbling upon this idea that there was this guild or this craft of initiates that executed all of these great structures in architectural history. And then, so I started looking into the Freemasons and discovered that there was a lot of amazing history there. And this was before the days of the internet. And so what you'd had was, sporadically you would have like fundamentalists of various stripes attacking Freemasonry because of the fact of their broad-mindedness. They say, well, it's non-denominational, non-sectarian. You basically if you profess a belief in a supreme creator, however you visualize that, that's the working premise, right? So you can be Christian, you can be Jew, you can be Muslim, you can be many kinds of religious beliefs. You probably can't be an atheist, because if your belief is that it's all just some random meaningless thing, then all the rest of it makes no sense, right? And so Freemasons do not proselytize at all. They do not go out and try to convert people over to their belief system. In fact, it's just the opposite. They do not recruit at all. The way you become a Freemason is you as an individual have to act of your own volition. You have to make that positive step and go, what do I have to do? What do I have to do? What's the first step? Well, usually the response then is, well, you've just taken the first step, which the first step is to
ask the question,
knock at the door. And if you're sincere, there's a wealth of symbolism there, a wealth of knowledge encoded, and it's just sad and ridiculous to me, all of these conspiracy theories that have come up around Freemasonry, and I've looked into some of them, and they're almost laughable. But it's tragic that here you have this fraternity that basically raises $2 million a year in private charities that go mostly to helping children, disadvantaged children of one way or another, who've health issues or disabled, disabilities, or homeless, or some such thing as that. And then they have this heritage of symbolism that they have preserved for centuries and centuries and centuries. And these people are going to make this judgment based upon some idiosyncratic interpretation of history, that Freemasonry are somehow, offshoots of the Illuminati, and they're behind everything, pulling the strings. And it's laughable. It is really laughable. There have been lots of prominent Freemasons of many stripes, from many walks of life, but the fact that there's some kind of concerted, organized Masonic conspiracy to control the world. And I know that saying this, the true believers that have already made up their mind, it's not going to sway them. They're set. They're dead set into this, fixated into this belief. Fine, I'm not trying to convince anybody of any. It's the people who maybe heard a few things one way or another and don't know really what to believe. All I say is look into it for yourself. Do your own homework. Do your own research into the history of the craft, and you'll see that what a valuable contribution they have made to human civilization on this planet, and what a rich, incredibly rich heritage that has been preserved by the craft. And we've barely begun to tap that yet. I mean, it's just like a treasure trove that, when it's opened, is just going to provide us with insight into the deep history of our own and spiritual history of our own species on this planet.
That's good. Thanks for answering that. I mean, I think people wanted to probably hear you talk about that. I don't think we talked about it much on the show yet with you. So, yeah, it's good to hear that.
Yeah, good. I feel like because, when I joined, there wasn't any of this. The limited availability of information, you had to go to, metaphysical bookstores, and a lot of the stuff had been written, in the turn of the century, late 19th century. And, there was an anti-Masonic movement for a while that was mainly driven by fundamentalist, ideas that, because Freemasons were too tolerant of different points of view. But then that died down. And there have been, like, one of the things I point out is I think there have been 14 American presidents. That's what I was going to say. 14. And the last one was Gerald Ford. I in the interview that I did on Gaiam Television last spring, I made that point. And then, in these, chat logs or whatever, people were challenging that. So, George Bush, was a Freemason, which he certainly was not. Let's be clear. George Bush was not a Freemason, right? The last Masonic president was Gerald Ford, and before him it was Harry Truman, and before him it was FDR, and there have been, like I said, 14 Masonic presidents, but I forget if it was 22 or 23 of the presidents have been Episcopalians. Wow! So really, I think we need to be looking at the Episcopalians.
I agree.
Who really are the puppet masters here.
I've already been looking at them.
Yeah.
They're trouble.
That's what I'm saying. Do we have any Episcopalians in the... No, none of you guys? Okay.
Right on. Well, thanks, guys. I don't want to keep you up too much longer. Do you have anything else to say, Ed? Or
well, just that I'm looking forward to this trip and spending a little time and getting to share some of my findings with you, as well as find out these things from your work and how this all ties in, and looking forward to that.
Yeah. So we're going to spend the next 7-8 days. We're going to be exploring the lakes and the river valleys, and we're going to be looking at drumlin fields, all in the Cordilleran region, the central Cordilleran region, with the idea in mind that what we're doing is we're documenting evidence for the great meltdown 13,000 years ago, and trying to trace the source of these gigantic floods that we've been studying in Montana, Idaho, and Washington to their source.
Nice.
Right. What's
I don't-
causing them? And
And I don't know if we're going to get there on this one, but we're going to get closer to it. You
Right
know,
on. Well, it sounds like a good time.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
have some
looking
great
forward to it.
scenery.
And you
anyway.
got some good weather too. You just missed
Yeah.
all the storms. So,
So you guys are tagging along tomorrow?
Yeah, we're gonna go as far as Revelstoke anyway.
And you know, Revelstoke, one of the things we could do while we're in
And we're
Revelstoke
gonna stop at the divide and
and relieve ourselves.
relieve ourselves. Yeah.
So you go on one side and it'll go to the Gulf of Mexico, and I'll go on the other side and it'll go to the Pacific.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right?
oh, boy.
so
Don't
what,
You guys want to partake? We'll have a little ritual.
what were you,
Okay.
what were you going to say about Revelstoke?
Well, Revelstoke was the site of one of the great meteorite falls of the 20th century, and I think there might be a museum there that has some stuff, so we could check that out and stop and see what we could learn.
Nice.
Yeah.
that's
Absolutely,
good.
it's
Yeah,
gonna be a
look
good time.
forward
We're
to
gonna we'll see what else we come up with because we've got that little digital recorder, so we might just stash it in your guys's
Oh, no.
in your SUV someplace and see what we come up with.
Well, then, okay.
Do we have room for that little digital recorder in that
guys
SUV?
traveling together because this thing could.
We got stuff hanging off the back of that thing.
I think we better get a lady in the bunch so we behave ourselves.
We'll be all right.
Yeah.
Okay, because. Well, okay.
Well, actually, yeah. No,
Well, I've never traveled with
Right, we
Florida,
haven't.
so I don't know what I'm in for yet.
Right on. Well, that's about it, I guess. Hey, Darren, what do you think?
Yeah,
Put these guys to
it's,
bed.
Is it bedtime?
It's almost 12:30. I
Oh,
suppose
yeah.
that's
Bedtime.
a good note to end it on, and we can all squeeze into the house and shut her down. Yeah, thanks to everyone for tuning in. We ended up going over 2 hours anyway.
No, after I stated emphatically I wasn't going to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, did you?
Well, I wasn't too emphatic, but
Yeah, well, right on. Thanks,
Yeah,
guys.
thanks
Okay.
a bunch.
Great.
Thank you
David.
guys for having us and your hospitality. We really
Yeah, no-
appreciate
no
seeing you
kidding.
guys, and
You
we
guys-
really appreciate that.
yeah,
Anytime.
I want everybody to know that these guys are putting us up.
Yes.
We had some great burgers earlier. Bill did some fishing.
Beautiful place here in the lake.
Had a comfortable bed they're putting me up in
Nice.
to sleep. So, hey,
Well, we'll be down at Georgia's eventually.
Yeah, maybe.
I better do some housekeeping.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's good to have you guys here.
Yeah,
Thanks.
anytime.
Thanks again,
Absolutely.
guys. We'll see you at the Paradigm.
Okay, that was our chat with Randall Carlson, Ed Nightingale. Big thanks to Daven for coming all the way up from Lethbridge and joining us for the interview. Yeah, he drove 2 hours home. I don't think he got home till around 4 in the morning. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. Graham and I tagged along with Randall and Ed. Who else was there? Randall, Ed, Bill, Bryan, George, Brad, myself, and Graham. We all went to Revelstoke. We had a good time out there, and yeah, I suppose that's about it. We're hoping to hook back up. Those guys are still wandering around BC. We're hoping to hook back up with them possibly Saturday afternoon, maybe for a quick podcast. Until then, make sure to tune in this Wednesday, coming up Wednesday at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. We will be broadcasting our backstage feed of our chat with Duncan Trussell. And yeah, that should be a good one. Other than that, support the show, grimerica.ca/support. Help us stay ad and sponsor affiliate free, all that jazz. If you can't help us out with some cash, maybe you can head over to grimerica.ca/iTunes and leave us a review, or maybe you can just tell some friends about the show. On that note, thanks for listening to this special in studio episode with Randall, Ed, myself, Graham, and Daven, and we will see you guys next week.